I have a controversial opinion, and it is about Warcraft 3 balance. Are you ready for it? This is gonna blow you away. I think the Warcraft 3 balance is the best it has ever been. And Warcraft 3 has been out for more than 20 years. In my previous video, you saw me complain about the design and the balance for StarCraft 2. And despite all that, I loved my time in SC2 and I had a great time there. And I'm of course also a huge fan of Warcraft 3, and at sometimes the balance has been in a pretty bad spot. Then Reforged came out. It was announced in 2018, 2019 or something. Reforged would end up coming out in 2020, and it's been out for 4 years. It was one of the worst Metacritic reviewed games ever, not because the original game was not good, but because Reforged was such a crap. Don't worry, my editor's gonna edit that out. Reforged really let people down, including me, and it was very disappointing. However, it was just the dressing up of the game that got messed up. Everything around it, the core game itself, was still the core game itself. Except, was it though? Because alongside with another slew of changes that Blizzard brought for Reforged, they also endeavored to change the balance of the game. It was just another point in a long list of changes that Blizzard would purport to bring for the good of Warcraft 3 in order to sell more copies of Reforged. But the only question is, did they still have a balance team that could actually handle such a titanic endeavor? For you see, Warcraft 3 was a competitive esports as early back as early 2003, starting with the Sonokong MBC Prime League in Korea. You had the OnGameNet League. These were traditions that followed up from the Brood War success that South Korea had found themselves in. Brood War was a major world phenomenon, but it really started to be kickstarted in Korea, South Korea in fact, where it adopted such a large popularity that StarCraft 2 pro gamers were heralded as heroes. It was so crazy that when I would go to Korea for the first time for the Blizzard Worldwide Invitational in 2003, this was for Warcraft 3, that I would go jump into a taxi in order to go to COEX Mall, which is a famous mall in the center of Seoul, which is the capital of South Korea. And the taxi driver, they were always very friendly, many different cabs. They would always ask where you come from and what are you doing and stuff. I realized I kind of like small talk. And so they would ask what you're doing here. Teacher? I'm like, no, I am pro gamer. They're like, pro gamer. Oh, pro gamer. Oh, StarCraft? And I'll be like, no, Warcraft. They're like, And of course they didn't speak that much English and I didn't speak any Korean. And that pretty much killed the conversation. Except if they would ask where you come from. The disappointment was quite palpable because Warcraft 3 never achieved the same popularity as StarCraft in Korea. And the disappointment was therefore quite palpable. But they got excited again once I said where I was from. They're like, America? And I'll be like, no, I'm actually from the Netherlands. Netherlander! Netherlander! Good! Hiddink! Because Hiddink was a Dutch football coach that helped to propel the South Korean team in the World Championship to like, what was it, like top 4 or something? So like, I was a good guy because Hiddink was a good guy because he did good for the South Korean football team. So pretty cool. Anyway, they're really friendly to foreigners there. I've always felt so welcome. Awesome country to visit. But anyways, South Korea popularized Brood War and they tried to do the Warcraft 3 and everything. And in the West, likewise, you had organizations looking to pick up Warcraft 3 as an esport. And in those times, third-party organizations could pretty much just hold tournaments for Blizzard games. And Blizzard didn't really have such a tight rein yet on the esports licensing side of things. That would only come much later with StarCraft 2, which for pro gamers was actually mostly a good thing, as I mentioned in my previous video, because tournaments were actually kind of forced to pay out prize money. In Warcraft 3, it was a little bit more Wild West. Nonetheless, I had an amazing time and an amazing career in Warcraft 3 with many great experiences all across the world, traveling to all the different continents and so many different countries for these tournaments. So I am one of the most prolific Warcraft 3 players for the period 2003 to 2010, in part due to the luck of coming from a small country called the Netherlands, where there really wasn't that much competition. In all of my time in esports, which is from 2003 to 14, I believe I've only lost one regional qualifier. And that is for both Warcraft 3 and StarCraft 2. So every single tournament that had national qualifiers, it really wasn't that hard usually. And when it was hard, I still managed to overcome. But this gave me a lot of opportunity to qualify and get paid trips to tournaments across the world. Whereas a player that might be just as good as me or better from South Korea may not even qualify because they have to fight in the Lion's Den. Right? They're in the Hornet's Nest. There's another 50 players that are just as good as them trying to fight for the top spots. So with that opportunity that I got, with that luck that I got, I managed to get a lot of international experience. And that, of course, also made me better. But I never forget how I was lucky with that. And it ended up helping me a lot. So I have a lot of experience, and I've played it in many different metas. I play in the meta now, and in 2020, and in 2003, and 2010. So I've seen all kinds of different strategies and metas for Warcraft 3. So, why am I saying the balance is the best now that it has ever been? I roughly separate balance in two categories. And for this, let's go look at some text. Balance, I think, comes down to both options of how you play, the amount of options that are available to you, as well as the relative win rates that your race has against all the other races. So Warcraft 3 has 4 races: human, orc, undead, and elf. And there's a short period of 2003, which is like early 2003 until maybe something like July, where it was Reign of Chaos, which is the original game. And then TFT would end up being out, I believe, August plus 2003. And that kind of changed the game because it added +2 units per every race, right? So that changed the game quite a bit. But there were also balance patches from time to time. Sometimes multiple a year. Sometimes we would go for some years without a lot of patches. And of course, 2020 brought Reforged, which also ended up rebalancing the game. They wanted to have that on their resume. And it's one of the things where Blizzard actually did deliver. Unlike the 4 hours of cutscenes that they said Reforged would be bringing, which they didn't end up delivering. Or the revamped campaign, or, you know, a client that actually works properly, or a ladder that actually counts its wins properly. Some of these things we still hold out hope for are still going to be coming to us. But for the balance part, as much as it is fun to hate on developers for the mistakes that they've made, a lot of interesting things happened. In early 2020, we had some patches that didn't quite hit the mark, but did change a lot of things up. While some things got overbalanced and too many buffs were given to a single thing. For instance, Undead received like 5 balance buffs to being able to expand, and Elf got about 12 buffs to a popular tier 1 strategy. And when I say 12 buffs, you think, how is that possible? The way that the balance was done, it was actually being spearheaded by Matt Morris. Matt Morris was the original campaign designer for Warcraft 3 way back when, and he was re-enlisted to work on Reforged. So he's a campaign designer, which means making fun missions that are good to scale for single-player experience. His expertise was not to do proper multiplayer balancing, but he is a professional, an industry professional, so he tried to gather data from, you know, people from the scene. He tried to look at the stats. He's got his telemetry, and he looks at these things and he sees these heroes aren't being used as much. These units aren't being used as much. So let's give everything that doesn't get used that much a buff. So that's what would end up happening. And so what happened is you have Keeper of the Grove, Alchemist, Huntress, Archer were all receiving buffs together. Sometimes multiple. Healing Spray on Alchemist now no longer did what I call friendly fire, but it doesn't make sense because Healing Spray is a good effect. So how can you friendly fire? Well, it's actually enemy fire. So what Alchemist Healing Spray was a targeted, channeled area of effect heal that also heals enemy units if they're in that area. And the Healing Spray would end up healing the enemy, so you had to aim it on yourself. It's a cool skill expression, Just like Blizzard should not be cast on yourself because it's friendly fire, Healing Spray should not be cast on the enemy. But as a result, it pretty much didn't get used much, so they got rid of that. Healing Spray is now only friendly spray, right? Entangle got buffed, Force of Nature got buffed, Huntress got buffed, their upgrades got buffed, Archer got buffed, Upgrade got buffed, so Moonwell got buffed. So before you know it, you had all these buffs, and suddenly the new strategy for Elf is Mass Tier 1 with Keeper and then Alchemist, and now you've got this OP new strategy that was really good against Orc. And eventually it got nerfed. And that's the key here. It's not what Blizzard did with Reforged initially. It's that there were some people that ended up working on Warcraft balance in the last 4 years that made minute adjustments that I think left the place in the best place it has ever been. But let's first go back to the past before we get to the present. In 2003, Reign of Chaos, this is my estimation of the balance. It's pretty hard to get numbers on this. This is just my opinion and memory of that time. Most people would agree that in ROC, human was the best. WCG 2003 was a tournament in Reign of Chaos when Frozen Throne was already out. Frozen Throne came out before World Cyber Games somewhere in November. This World Cyber Games was in Seoul, South Korea. But they decided not to use the TFT rule set because everyone had already qualified for Reign of Chaos, which is a decision I didn't like at the time, but I do think it's a logical decision. If you qualify for a Reign of Chaos tournament, in a Reign of Chaos qualifier, it kind of doesn't make sense to make a new game the game that you actually end up playing at the tournament and to change the rules. So they did what they thought is best, but it is not the hypest because most people are mentally moving on already to the expansion, right? So there was this tournament, then you had the Euro Cyber Games, or as they called it, the Samsung Euro Championship later. We called it ECG 2003. And then you had ESWC 2003. This was won by He-Man, a human. This was won by Insomnia, a human. And ECG, I believe, was won by Fatsy, also a human. So you had the three major tournaments, all won by human. WCG was also a human-human finals. ESWC was Mad Frog against He-Man. It was an undead. And Fatsy also beat a human in the final. So it's 5 out of 6 humans. They were generally the best race. The best chance that people had against human was by playing elf. And then undead and orc both had a tough time against human. So they were kind of the strongest. And then undead actually had orc's number back then. The outlier to this rule was pretty much Dayfly. He managed to win against undead sometimes with crazy strats like mass grunts and forest troll berserkers from the mercenary camp. Mad Frog was an outlier in undead's capabilities against human by winning ESWC 2003. Oh yeah, it's not He-Man that he didn't actually win this. Mad Frog got second, but he got really high beating humans. He-Man ended up winning this one, right? So Mad Frog managed to perform quite well against humans, but overall undead had a pretty tough time. And so this was the balance then. Then as we go on, I want to talk about the strategy options in early Warcraft 3. Orc didn't have a lot of options because they had no form of healing at tier 1. Without Shadowhunter and Healing Wave, Orc didn't have any healing, which means if you made grunts and they got hurt, that's it. They couldn't heal. Futties and Rifles could be healed by priests. Night Elf could heal on Moonwells and Bears. And Undead could at least heal with Cannibalize. Blight did pretty good healing. They had Death Coil, they had Unholy Aura, so there were all kinds of soft forms of healing. And ghouls could also just go back home and rotate out with healthy ghouls, and they would heal up on the Blight. Orc didn't really have healing unless they went for Healing Ward Witch Doctor, which has pretty much never really been a very competitive unit because you can just cancel the Healing Ward in combat, which means it's only an out of combat unit that they can use. So you had the mass casters, you had the mass wind riders, and you kind of sometimes saw grunt strategies, usually cheese. Usually you had the tower rush or you had the tower creep and then do some kind of tier 3 super fast deck. But it was pretty easy to counter because human and elf could do early expansion. And so anytime someone rushes to tier 3 for all kinds of things,
usually a tier 1 expander is going to beat that. Human had quite a few options. They had the casters, the griffins, they could fast expo or not, Knight Mortar. They had quite a few options that they could go for. Elf, you had mass archers, which were really good. I personally played a lot of bears and talons in tournaments and so on. They could do like straight fast expo without any units. There were all kinds of strats. Dryads. Undead had gargoyles. They had Ghoul Banshee, where they would put the anti-magic shell on the ghouls. They had fiends builds like Philbot from New Zealand, I believe. So options were relatively limited for everyone. And only human and elf could fast expand. Orc and undead could not. Then early 2003 and 2005 meta was probably the most fun Warcraft 3 has ever been strategically. There were all kinds of different builds you could do, exactly because people weren't that good yet. As the game goes on, people start cementing more and more in the meta, especially when the game's balance doesn't change much. And what would happen is that people's execution isn't good enough yet compared to the strategical ingenuity that you can inject in the game. So if you came out with a cool new build with units that are generally seen as underdog units, people wouldn't know the counter yet. And because they haven't prepared against everything yet, they don't know how to play against it. So I played all kinds of things. I had a build where I would make Grunt Shaman, and then tier 2 expand against human, and then I would add double bestiary and start making Wind Riders and Kodos. And I also played this against undead. You could do mass raiders, hit and run, mass expansion. I had a Headhunted Tauren build that I won a tournament with. I had a Shaman Bloodlust Tauren that I won Samsung Euro Championship 2005 with. Then I had a Mass Tauren and Spirit Walker build that I won 2006 SEC with, if I remember correctly. Later, this was beaten by humans playing Mortar Team or Firelord to blow up the corpses so that the corpses cannot be resurrected, which is a wild counter situation when you think about it, and something that we really don't see a lot right now. There was Walkers and Taurens. There was the very ubiquitous Grunt Raider Walker. Sometimes you saw Mass Air or Bat Rider focused strategies. So lots of different possibilities, right? And this is just for Orc. And I don't want to go too deep into the other three races because, you know, I'm the main character in my experience, and I played Orc from 2003 onwards in Frozen Throne. So through that perspective, I'm showing you the development of the meta and the balance. So from 2006, it got more stale. As people got better, people started refining the same build that they felt was best in the widest variety of different situations. For Undead, it was usually Ghoul, Fiend, Destroyer, and Statue, with very few deviations. Gone were the days of 2003 Mass Abominations and Meat Wagons. Gone were the days of mass Garg spamming sometimes. I say that Hazuop still Garg spammed, but Happy didn't do it that much anymore at that time. So I would say Undead probably had 2-3 builds. Orc in particular pretty much had just one build. We played Grunt Raider Walker every time. And why is that? Headhunters were pretty bad. They were low health, low range, easily killed. And you didn't have enough time to go to tier 3 in the meta of the game. Wind Riders, as they are now, as they were then, are really not a main unit you could go for because they are too easily countered by every race. Torrents are unreachable, you pretty much die before you get there. Because fortified burrows were only unlockable via tier 3, you'd be open up to burrow attacks if they ever see you fast teching to try and get them. Demolisher attacks are dodgeable. Before, this didn't matter. In 2003, the Orc mirror meta was actually Grunt, Kodo, Demo. That's it. Kodo eats the Grunt. Kodo cannot eat Kodo, so Kodo beats Grunt because Kodo eats Grunt. But Demo beats Kodo because Kodo is unarmored and has no armor, and Demo has huge siege damage. I don't know exactly how much, which does 50% bonus damage on unarmored, I believe it is. Either 50 or 25%. So the Kodo's 1000 HP is gonna get hurt like, I don't know, 150 to 170 damage per hit. And of course, Grunt beats Demo because Demo has minimum range. So you had this counter sheet, and this is pretty much what we played. But then, as people got better, guess what happened? People start microing. And what do? It's very simple. They move the Kodo. And now the shot does 0 damage. Because the Kodo has been moved. Right? So as micro got better, demolishers are not so good anymore. Doctors, too easily countered. Bloodlust is punishable by destroyers, fairy dragons, and spellbreakers. So there was a whole bunch of units that weren't that useful. So what's really left? Grunt, Raider, Walker, Kodo. And those are the units that you would make. And everything else was just not viable. And you played this in every matchup. Orc Mirror, you played it against Human. You kind of played it against Undead as well, or maybe without the Walker, and then you add Kodo, right? And maybe some Headhunters. Maybe some Wind Riders, kind of a mixture. It's kind of a cool mix. And then against Night Elf, Grunt, Raider, Walker. And that's pretty much it. So once you get to a situation where you can pretty much only play one build, where you've only got one available build to you, opponent is certain what you're going to do. There are no more, curveballs that create an ambiguity where someone has to guess rock, paper, scissors, or they have to be well versed in very different strategies. And that has an effect on the win rates of things. When you become predictable, your win rate drops. This is a very easily provable correlation. And that means that necessarily strategical variety gives you win rate strength. Now, Undead only had one playstyle against Orc. They needed to quickly hit a timing to stop the expansion. Whereas Orc could play Raider Hit and Run, they could play Tier 2 early expansion against Undead, they could play Air, they could play Ground. There was a lot of different things your Orc could do, but they would always make an expansion, which means it always put a timer on the Undead to do some kind of timing attack at minute 9 or minute 10, and if they don't, they lose. Orc Undead was a matchup that I pretty much never lost. I won many tournaments because of it, because not only was it favored for me, because I had more options to pick from, and it was just... I had too many racial advantages in the direct comparison of the two matchups, but I also happened to be a specialist in it, in particular, irrespective of the balance. Other orcs also win more against Undead, but I won more than any other orc against Undead. This was my specialty matchup, and I pretty much beat every Undead in the world in this matchup. It was a big advantage, and a lot of people complained, rightfully so, about Orc as Undead players. In fact, it was so bad that many Undeads that ended up switching to StarCraft 2 in 2010 or 2011 tried to predict what is the Orc of StarCraft 2. Because they were so traumatized by losing to Orc as Undead that they tried to make sure that they pick the OP race in SC2. And, with varied success. I leave it up to you to think, what is the Orc of StarCraft 2? So that's the Orc Undead matchup. Then Orc Human was tough. Pretty much the opposite was happening. I told you about how Orc goes for like an early expansion. I call it a tier 2.1 expo. AKA very early on in tier 2, we go for an expo. 2.5 would be like mid-time of tier 2 expo, and 2.9 would be like expoing right before you get tier 3, right? That's kind of my personal terminology system. Sometimes you can expand as your tier 2 tech is coming. I call that a tier 1.5 expo. So tier 2.1 expo was very common, and this put a timer on Undead. And you need to understand this because balance and gameplay is always a case of proactivity versus reactivity, right? If you find out through empirical evidence and through statistical evidence and telemetry that one race consistently sets the pace because they are more advantageous when they are left alone than the other race that is also left alone and is also doing their proactive part, then you start to realize that the race that gets ahead when both races do nothing to each other to disrupt each other, the race that gets ahead That's the proactive one. And it's just a fact, right? If I start a race with you, and in 24 hours we'll see who earns the most money in I don't know, selling old shoes from our garage, and if every time you win, then I know that you're the proactive one because I need to react by beating your system. Like, if we both do our own thing, you're winning. So I need to now go disrupt you, steal your shoes, hit you over the head with a shoe, try to sell better shoes than the one you're selling. I need to do something special, because it's not going to work for me to outcompete you with our own way. By StarCraft 2 comparison, if both races leave each other alone, Zerg will make many more drones than any other race can because of the larva mechanic. That means Zerg is the first proactive one in setting the pace of making an opponent have a forced reactivity, right? But in a way, it is also a proactive thing for Terran to decide to do like a Hellion move out or a Marine drop in order to set the pace of harassment. But the only reason that they feel like they need to invest in that is because they're going to fall behind if they don't do anything. So in this situation, Orc is proactively able to have the right to set the pace of the game. They're the game pace setter. And Undead has to react by doing debilitating amounts of damage to make sure that they stay even Steven in the game. For Orc Human, it was different. Or maybe it's also a bit the same. I feel like, in a way, Orc also gets ahead if both leave each other alone and don't disrupt each other and have a gentleman's agreement to stay on one base. But what would usually happen is if both players play passive, then the human goes for a tier 1 expo. And then human wins if Orc leaves it alone. So human sets the pace of the game if they decide to expand. But if human doesn't expand, then Orc will eventually win the game. So what human has to do then is they have to attack the Orc in order to stop them from getting high-level heroes that can wreak havoc on their caster line via Shockwave and Chain Lightning high level. So usually either human expands tier 1 and then Orc has to non-stop harass to slow down the human expo and then eventually counter expand. And in this scenario, human has a small edge based on the statistics that I found from my own games and other people's games. But if human didn't expand, which is their own choice, human has a bigger edge because what they would end up doing is a tier 2.1 tower rush. And this rush was so hard to stop that you could tell someone you're going to do it as a human and it could still work. You could be faced with that tower rush, the very same one, 100 times in a row, and you would still lose 60 of it. Even though you could try to prepare exactly as you want to. You could try to tower up your base, right? You could try to make as many units as you can. You could do all kinds of things, it would still work. It was pretty crazy. And that gave them a small little edge in the win rate. For Orc Elf, it was an almost balanced matchup at the very high level, though at the below high level, Elf had a bigger advantage. They almost primarily played Druids of the Talon mass. Druids of the Talon mass seems like a weird, wonky strategy to use, but they would cyclone all the Orc heroes, and then their hero and summoners, Demon Hunter, Beastmaster, Tinker, would clear up the Orc army as their heroes were flying. You would try to counter this with Grunt Raider Walker, and there'd be a lot of micro involved. It's actually a really cool matchup to fight, but it was pretty much always Mass Druids of the Talon, and it was always Grunt Raider Walker. The strategical variety was quite stale and low. Elf had a small edge, but it was a pretty cool matchup to fight, even though it always felt tough from Orc side. And when I played it from Elf side, it didn't feel that tough by comparison. But high-level Orcs got so good at the micro against Talons that we were able to almost win half the time. Now we go to the balance nowadays. I have opened the W3 Champions third-party ladder, which is the only telemetry available to people right now. BNet stats are neither very relevant nor available to us, so this is the only stats we can use. Of course, you can sort in many different ways. You can select different patches. You can select different MMR slices. And if you're looking for a particular stat, you can probably cook it the way you like it. But I've looked at the all patch, all maps, and I've looked at 1800 plus MMR. 1800 plus MMR that is called Diamond, and I think that's fair. You're pretty good at Warcraft 3 if you're 1800 MMR. But it's, of course, not even sub-top player. It is not a tournament player yet. So not as important, but relevant to the middle level player base or the above average level player base. For a reference point, when you start playing on W3 Champions, I believe you start at, correct me if I'm wrong, chat, 1500 MMR. Starting at 1500, and that means that if that's the starting point, then you would have to lose a bit to go below that, and you have to win a bit to go above it. So 1800, not bad. So you can sort by that, and then you can see that Orc has 50 win rate against Human, 52 against Undead, and almost 50 against Night Elf. Undead has 51 against Human. Undead loses to Orc with a 2% deficit, right? 48%. And they win against Elf at 51. And Night Elf, and the only matchup we haven't seen yet, is Night Elf against Human, is 50-50. Orc 50-50, and Undead Night Elf has 49% win rate. So overall, not bad at all. When you go a little bit higher on the ranks, Masters, you see that Orc 49 against Human, 49.5 against Undead, and 47.5 against Night Elf is the weakest representation at the higher levels. Not huge percentage deficits, just a little bit of a drawback. And it's always hard to tell too with statistical anomalies like, very prolific skilled players that are by themselves potentially skewing the stats a bit. But these are the stats. They are what they are. Undead, 50.6 against Human, 50.5 against Orc, and 52 against Night Elf. And then Night Elf is winning against Human with 51%, against Orc, 52.5%, and against Undead, they have 2.5 or 2.2 deficit. So looking at this, the biggest problem in the current balance would be that Undead has a bit of an edge against Night Elf, that Orc doesn't have a good matchup, and that Night Elf has a bit of an edge against Orc. Not insurmountable win rate differences, but at exactly equal skill level, you would lose 52 out of 100 games against someone, which doesn't sound that bad, actually. Like, you cannot hope for a lot better balance. And to me, this looks pretty good. Even meta changes by specific players can cause a wave of change throughout the scene without any balance changes happening. So let's also talk about the versatility of openers that we have. In 2010, before Blizzard touched the game with Reforged and its many subsequent balance patches, probably about, I want to say we've had about 10 balance patches probably since Reforged came out, alongside with Reforged and in the precursor to Reforged, aka thanks to Blizzard's renewed interest in looking at WC3 and making some buck out of the Reforged. Our versatility. Keep in mind that in 2010, we pretty much played Grunt Raider Walker everywhere. Night Elf against Orc only played Druids of the Talon, and sometimes played, sometimes they played, 90% of the time Elf against Orc was Talons, 10% of the time they would play Bears. Now, in 2023, Elf can play Keeper Alchemist Tier 1, Mass Tier 1, and then go to Tier 2 and get the Alchemist out and everything. You can play Demon Hunter with some hero like either Panda or Naga or Keeper and then go to Tier 3. You could do Mass Dryads with Demon Hunter and Keeper and Thorn's Aura. You can play Talons still. This has resurfaced on maps like Last Refuge and some others where it is suitable, where you've got sufficient chokes to leverage Talons' range damage. We've had the Mass Archer build with Demon, Keeper, Priestess of the Moon, and double Orb of Venom, or even 3. This either in 2022 or in 2023. We don't see that as much now, but if we take the strategical options Elf has had in the last 2 years, even just, there have been many more builds than just the 1 or 2 that we saw before. For Orc, we now have Grunt openers, just like we always had, We always had grunt openers with 2 burrows back then. But now we have grunt opener with 1 burrow. We have grunt openers with 2 burrows. Right? Then we have headhunter openers, and this is because headhunters received some changes. Their regeneration upgrade went from 0.8 per second, I believe, to 1.0 per second. Little buff there. They got plus 25 HP, and I believe they got plus 100 range. Either way, headhunters received a bunch of changes like this that now have made them a viable starting or transitional unit. They're in fact so good that they got nerfed recently, I believe in cost and in health, and then the health nerf got reversed again. So there's been little tinkering, and I think they're in a pretty good spot right now. Now they're a valid opener. You also see fast tech openers with 17 out of 21 population and 0 units, 0 barracks. So that's already 3 different openers, which is pretty much more than we had back then. Then when you get to tier 2, you will either add 2 bestiaries, or a bestiary and a lodge, a bestiary and a totem, 2 bestiaries and a totem, like the build that Lynn showed against Undead, where he opens up with a Farseer fast tech, and then goes double bestiary, makes a wind rider and a raider and an ensnare, and he makes a walker, and then he goes bat riders and walkers against undead. I don't know how often he's still going to be playing that build, or if it was just a one-off, but this is at the highest level in competitive Warcraft 3, and he made it work, at least some of the time. We've seen Lynn's double barracks build, where he makes double barracks on the transition to tier 2, and then ends up working off that by making double headhunter production. And we've also seen straight tier 3 after making a couple of starting units, such as the Hitman build from 2021, where it is Blade Master, 3 grunts, Shadow and tier 3. Then you go for a late bestiary, a Tauren Chieftain, you make 1 or 2 Raiders, 1 or 2 Kodos, and you play a tier 3 Orc versus Undead style. So this is, if you count the amount of openers as a multiplier, let's say 3, and you see 6 follow-ups, that's 18 permutations, which is so much more than we had back in 2010. Partially, I think, because people got better, but I think partially because the balance changes by Blizzard opened the game up a bit. So I think that's awesome. Undead has so many more options now. Undead received a number of balance changes as well. Matt Morris spoke with many people, and everyone agreed Undead cannot expand. Not just can't fast expand, which Orc also cannot do. Only Human and Elf can do it. Human does it the best, then Elf. Undead just can't expand. The last time Undead had expansion-based play was 2003 by New Zealand's Philbot. Right? He did fast expansion, and then he made 6 Spirit Tower on the base. Then he took another base and he made another 6 Spirit Tower. That ancient Warcraft 3 memory that worked then would not work now anymore. Right? Undead couldn't expand because of a number of reasons. The vulnerability of their acolytes, the cost of making both a gold mine and a necropolis, the blight, which revealed like a sore sight to people, hey, I have an expansion here. Even if you weren't going to scout it, the giant black circle around the gold mine certainly revealed to all that have eyes that there's something clandestine, something covert going on there. And oh, lo and behold, there's a undead gold mine with acolytes. So I posited a number of balance buffs to the balance council, not the council, to the balance team at Blizzard, that fell into good ears, that enabled undead, and I'm sure I'm not the only one, that enabled undead expansion. They included the shrinking. No, you couldn't see the expansion through Fog of War. I'm just saying if you're in the vicinity of. That's all. So I posited that the Haunted Gold Mine by itself should do less blight spread, so that if someone sneaks an expansion, Undead is more likely to be able to get away with it, just like other races can get away with that. Right? Undead was the only one that really couldn't. So they slightly shrank the blight spread from the gold mine. Blizzard would end up enabling sacrificial skull purchase on the shop without pre-requiring a graveyard. Perhaps the most important change of all, because it allows you to rush a Nerubian before your gold mine finishes, rather than after. Acolytes got given 10 bonus HP. Gold mines would become cheaper, Necropolis would become cheaper, and Acolytes would end up regenerating more while on Blight. These were all changes that greatly enabled early expansion play, and Happy and many other players, and Happy was a very late switcher into it, were now able to do expansion plays, tier 1 expo openers. And in fact, we've seen Undead tier 1 expand with all 4 different heroes: Dreadlord, Death Knight, Lich, and Cryptlord. X-Lord was a big proponent in 2021 of the Cryptlord fast expansion opener, where Cryptlord also received many buffs, of course, which helped it as well. But we've seen all of them, and that is wild to think of, because in 2010, Undead could not expand, right? Just couldn't even expand at all. It wasn't valid, it wasn't sensible. Sometimes they tried, and it was just too easy to counter. So we have all this, 4 different heroes they can expand. We have Ghoul Fiend openers like the Tet build, where you do 16 out of 20 pop fast tech with 3 ghouls tech, and then you make 1 Fiend and you're 19 out of 20, and then you make the second Ziggurat. We had that build, really popular for a while. We've had the Fiend opener, which is like Crypt plus Graveyard into Altar, into Ziggurat at the start. And we have the now mostly popular Ghoul openers that end up getting used in most matchups. So again, different openers possible. Once you get to tier 2, there are again different builds available for Undead. If they did do a tier 1 expo, we've seen tier 2 pushes being available. Slaughterhouse, Temple of the Damned, DK Pitlord or DK Beastmaster try to do like an early timing attack to stop the opponent's counter expansion after Undead establishes one. We've seen Mass Gargoyles, tier 3 tech with the Slaughterhouse, which is the most common and the most meta. We've seen some Temple of the Damned play, double Slaughterhouse sometimes. We've seen double Crypt plus Slaughterhouse, such as is being used right now by Happy against Orc, with upgraded ghouls, which is also a wild thing. We never saw upgraded ghouls in 2010, right? So a lot of different builds as well. Elf is doing all kinds of builds, as I showed, and didn't really go into human because human, every unit is useful. It was then and it still is. Some are more niche and some are more versatile, but every single unit has a place. There are some units in other races that aren't quite as good, such as Torrents, Doctors, Frostworms, Necromancers, Meat Wagons, Hippo Rider, and Glaive Thrower. Mountain Giant has regressed a bit. Frostworm has regressed a bit. Doctors are still hard to actually use in a game. Turrets are better than ever because they have a small latent pulverize that doesn't require an upgrade, and they're a bit cheaper to get towards. They're a bit faster to get towards. Necromancers are better than ever. So I think a lot of positive changes were made to the possible versatility, the possible strategical diversity that Warcraft 3 can have, and the stats show pretty good numbers. And that is why I think there is not a singular matchup that is as deserving of complaints, that is as in need, as entitled to change as there has been at any point in the history of Warcraft 3. And that is why I think Warcraft 3 balance is in the best place it has ever been. And it has made the game a lot of fun to play. I think for both pro, casual, and washed up alike. Hope you enjoyed this video. See you around. Oh, and don't forget, if you made it this far, to hit that sub button like it is a mole and you're playing whack-a-mole.